This morning, the quiet bureaucratic machine at Miami International Airport didn't just turn away a man. It signaled the formal end of the era of the globalized, frictionless tournament. When Omar Artan, the Confederation of African Football's Referee of the Year, was held for 11 hours and then deported despite holding a diplomatic passport, a valid visa, and full FIFA credentials, the public saw a story about immigration vetting. But that is the surface narrative. Look closer at the architecture of the 2026 World Cup, and you will see that Artan's detention was not a security anomaly. It was a calculated, high-stakes flex of sovereign gatekeeping that has effectively fractured the tournament into two distinct operating zones: the American hardline security state and the Canadian-Mexican pressure relief valve. To understand why this matters for Canadian sovereignty, we must look at the timeline. The 2026 bid was sold to the world as a logistical triumph of trilateral cooperation. But since the first ball was kicked, the reality has devolved into a series of sequenced administrative blockades. In December 2025, the US government denied visas to the Iranian delegation for the World Cup draw, effectively forcing a boycott from a participating nation. Fast forward to the tournament proper, and that same pattern locked in. 14 Iranian support staff denied entry, forcing the team to live in a perpetual state of migration in Tijuana. Star striker Mehdi Taremi subjected to interrogation. Iraqi star Ayman Hussein held for 7 hours in Chicago, and a trail of journalists and fans from Morocco to Senegal finding themselves on the wrong side of a vanishing welcome mat. This is not a series of individual miscommunications. This is a sustained, top-down strategy of border enforcement that has transformed the world's most valuable sporting event into an arena of geopolitical exclusion. Consider the economic fallout as the leading indicator of this structural shift. This tournament was built on a projection of $40.9 billion in North American GDP and a historic $6.4 billion in tourism spending for the United States. Yet, 8 weeks before the opening match, the American Hotel and Lodging Association confirmed that 80% of hotels in host cities were missing their targets, while transatlantic bookings dipped 14%. The market is reacting to the friction. When the United States chooses to weaponize visa access against FIFA-credentialed officials and national team staff, it does more than inconvenience them. It forces the global football apparatus to seek alternatives. This is where the Canadian position becomes critical. Within hours of Artan's deportation, the response from Canadian leadership was not diplomatic silence. It was an aggressive move to capture the moral and logistical high ground. British Columbia Premier David Icke's public invitation for Artan to officiate in Vancouver, coupled with Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow's formal petition to FIFA, serves as a direct strategic challenge to the US posture. Canada is signalling that it is the accessible, functional, and legitimate host for the international community. While the US Department of Homeland Security continues to integrate ICE and Border Patrol into the stadium perimeter, forcing labor unions in Los Angeles and Seattle to negotiate contractual protections against deportation for their own stadium staff, Canada has positioned its cities as the neutral, open venues that the international community can actually rely upon. We are seeing a silent realignment of tournament power. When Iran's team is forced to house itself in Mexico and enter the US only for the match itself, they are not just playing a game. They are operating under the rules of an occupying security force. When Canadian leaders openly invite the very officials the US rejects, they are quietly drafting a new framework for how global events will be hosted on this continent moving forward. Canada is no longer just a junior partner in a joint bid. It is becoming the necessary open-door alternative for a global industry that can no longer afford the cost of American insularity. The data points from the hotel occupancy rates and the flight bookings prove that the world is noticing the shift. The tournament's economic engine is stalling in the United States while finding a path of least resistance through the north. But as Canadian politicians lean into this role as the pressure release valve, they are stepping into an increasingly volatile space where sovereignty, security, and international obligation collide. The most consequential question remains unanswered. How long can Canada maintain this open posture while remaining tethered to an American border policy that that increasingly views every international visitor as a potential threat. The cliffhanger we left on, the widening gap between a tournament promised as a global celebration and a reality defined by administrative exclusion, is not an accident of circumstance. It is the direct output of a deliberate, hardened policy architecture. To understand why a premier referee like Omar Artan is being deported, or why an entire national team is operating out of a hotel in Tijuana, you have to look at the intersection of FIFA's centralized logistics and the United States post-2026 security framework, specifically Presidential Proclamation 10998. This is the deal architecture that most mainstream coverage ignores. When the three host nations, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, agreed to the joint bid, there was an implicit understanding of shared sovereignty for the sake of the tournament. The reality is that the United States has unilaterally effectively deglobalized its portion of the Games through a combination of strict visa restrictions and an aggressive, omnipresent interior enforcement posture. Here is how that architecture functions. First, consider the centralized choke point. FIFA, in its effort to ensure absolute consistency, required all 52 tournament referees to undergo final training, vetting, and security clearance at a central hub in Miami. This is the single point of failure for the tournament's officials. By placing this hub on American soil, FIFA surrendered control over its own workforce to the United States Department of Homeland Security. When the US government invokes vetting concerns or classified information, as they did with Omar Artan, FIFA has no procedural mechanism to challenge that decision. They have effectively outsourced the gatekeeping of their own tournament staff to the US border apparatus. Second, look at the legal wall erected by Presidential Proclamation 10998, which took effect on January 1, 2026. This proclamation suspended or limited visa issuance to nationals of 39 countries. This isn't just about fans, it creates a structural impossibility for journalists, team administrative staff, and, as we have seen, players. Because FIFA mandates that teams train and prepare within the host nations, teams from these 39 nations are effectively barred from setting up standard camps on US soil. This is why the Iranian Federation was forced to relocate their training base to Tijuana. The deal is effectively a petitioned tournament. Teams from restricted nations are allowed to cross the border only for the 90 minutes of the match, often forced to stay in Mexico or elsewhere between games. This is not sports. This is highly managed conditional entry. Third, examine the domestic enforcement environment. The presence of ICE agents within the stadium footprint is not a minor security detail. It is a fundamental shift in the tournament's labour and safety model. When stadium workers at venues like SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles vote to authorize a strike specifically to secure contractual protection from immigration enforcement, it reveals the climate of fear created by the DHS. The irony is that the tournament was sold as an economic engine projected to generate $40.9 billion for North America, but that projection relied on the assumption of free movement. By prioritizing border security over the fluidity of the tournament, the US has created an economic friction that is now showing up in the 14% drop in transatlantic bookings and the 80% of hotels missing their occupancy targets. Canada has become the pressure release valve because it is the only host nation that has refused to adopt the same level of border insularity. While Canadian politicians like David Eye and Olivia Chow are not the ones running the tournament, FIFA is their public calls to accommodate rejected officials, and teams are not merely performative. They are signalling to FIFA that if the United States continues to treat its portion of the tournament as a closed security zone, Canada is willing to absorb the overflow. The architectural reality is that we now have a tournament operating on two different sets of rules. The American side, where sovereignty is defined by exclusion and internal enforcement, and the Canadian side, which is attempting to salvage the original vision of the inclusion tournament. But the deeper, more dangerous question remains. As teams and media continue to rout around the American visa blockade by leaning on Canadian infrastructure, does this create a sustainable model? Or is the North American joint bid collapsing under the weight of its own contradictory immigration policies? The 2026 World Cup has effectively morphed from a celebration of global integration into a stress test for the fraying North American partnership. We have moved from a unified trilateral vision to a fractured reality where the United States operates as a closed security fortress, while Canada, and to a lesser extent, Mexico, serves as the necessary diplomatic and logistical workaround for a global event that the US can no longer fully facilitate. This is not a temporary glitch in the tournament schedule, it is the new baseline for continental relations. In the pre-Trump era, the assumption was that a host nation's borders were a matter of administrative process. Today, those borders are an instrument of statecraft. By conditioning the entry of athletes, officials, and journalists on the political whims of the current administration, the United States has signaled that it values internal enforcement and security theatre above its obligations to international sporting bodies and its own co-hosting partners. The broader implications for Canada are profound. For decades, our sovereignty was tethered to the assumption of a seamless, integrated North American space. This tournament has exposed the fragility of that bond. When Canadian leaders like David Icke or Olivia Chow publicly invite the very individuals the US State Department turns away, they are doing more than scorekeeping or scoring political points. They are asserting a distinct Canadian foreign policy in real time. They are proving that Canada can, and will, act as a sovereign entity that honours its international commitments even when its primary security partner defaults on them. This creates a strategic divergence that will persist long after the final whistle in July. Look at the sector-specific impacts. We are already seeing a shift in how international organisations view the safety of American infrastructure for high-level events. With the 2028 Summer Olympics looming on the US horizon, the institutional memory of this summer's visa blockades, the ice in stadiums policy, and the economic shortfall in host city hotels will be a permanent weight on future US bids. International capital and global governing bodies are now acutely aware that the openness of the United States is contingent, not guaranteed. This is a massive opening for Canada to rebrand itself as a reliable, predictable hub for global events, potentially shifting the long-term calculus of international trade and migration logistics toward the north. But we must be clear-eyed about the trade-off. By acting as the pressure release valve, Canada is absorbing the friction of the American security state. We are effectively insulating the tournament's continuity by allowing the excluded to route through our cities, but in doing so, we are also placing ourselves in the direct path of the US administrative gaze. We have successfully maintained the World Cup's integrity at a time when the host nation partnership is under immense strain. But we have also highlighted exactly how much we are willing to tolerate in the name of continental cooperation. The next critical juncture is not a match or a goal. It is the inevitable diplomatic reckoning that will follow the closing ceremony. As the final data on tourism losses, visa denials and stadium incidents is collated, the three host nations will have to answer a question they have spent the last month dodging. Is this a partnership of equals? Or have we moved into an era of managed fragmentation? Canada has held the line, but the cost of that stability will be measured in how we navigate the hardening of the border once the cameras leave. The era of frictionless North American cooperation